WTF happened to Conan the Destroyer? It's a question many like you and I have asked after witnessing this debacle that this Conan sequel was. Back in 1982, Conan the Barbarian sorted and magicked its way to success with R-rated savagery and a tone that was brooding alright, but just enough to be enjoyable. But 2 years later, Conan the Destroyer hit the theaters, and this time around, it was a lighter, campier adventure that succeeded in winding up, or rather destroying, Conan's live-action prospects for decades. How did a once promising sword and sorcery franchise fall on its own blade? What went wrong? Was it Arnold? Or the studio? Or something else entirely? Well, in this video, we're going to explore exactly that. But before I begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. And now, grab your sword and a sense of humor, 'cause we're diving right in. So in order to understand why the second one failed, it's important to understand why Conan the Barbarian triumphed. We need to understand what made the original Conan the Barbarian such a hit. Directed by John Milius and starring a younger Arnold Schwarzenegger, that film took Robert E. Howard's source material pretty seriously and didn't go about diluting anything. Schwarzenegger's Conan was not a quippy do-gooder, but a rough-edged anti-hero, someone who was an extremely cunning barbarian who loved to drink hard and fight harder. And he had to be this guy if he wanted to survive. 'Cause let's face it, he was living in the cruel Hyborian Age world, with all kinds of monsters and creatures and bad guys around. Keeping all this in mind, director Milius, along with co-writer Oliver Stone, created a brutal, operatic tale of revenge and destiny that meant every frame. The violence was hard R and uncompromising, yet it had a mythic gravity. Audiences responded to this muscular sincerity just the way it deserved. On a $20 million budget, Conan the Barbarian grossed around $70 to $80 million worldwide. In short, the original captured Conan's essence and Robert E. Howard's world that felt real, had a hero who was more survivor than superhero, and maintained a tone that treated the fantasy with respect. Needless to say, the success set high expectations and a sequel became inevitable. In fact, it was even teased in the first film's closing shot, with King Conan sitting on his throne. Oh, and Schwarzenegger was contractually signed for multiple Conan films, and the stage was set for a franchise with Conan the Destroyer as the next chapter. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, pretty much everything. The primary issue with Conan the Destroyer was that it was a very generic quest and felt like it was a live-action Dungeons & Dragons light. I mean, what do you think the movie is about? In theory, it's a straightforward sword and sorcery film, but in practice, it plays like a Saturday morning cartoon quest. The movie starts with Queen Taramis of Shadizar recruiting Conan for a journey to recover a magical jewel and a sacred horn, and the queen promises that if he succeeds, she would resurrect Conan's lost love Valeria as payment. Conan, along with his goofy thief sidekick Malik, escorts the queen's virginal young niece, Princess Jenna, on this mission. They're joined by Jenna's hulking bodyguard, Bombada, who secretly plans to betray Conan, and later by 2 new allies, Zula, a fierce female bandit, and Akiro, Conan's old wizard friend who conveniently needs rescuing from cannibals early on. Over about 100 minutes, this ragtag fellowship of the jewel and horn trudges through one fantasy cliché after another. They fetch a magic gem from an evil sorcerer's castle, then use it to fetch the horn of a dreaming god, facing random traps and monsters along the way. There's a Hall of Mirrors fight with a shape-shifting wizard, an ancient temple ritual, and a final battle against the demonic god Dagoth, who comes to life when the horn is plugged into his forehead. Conan ultimately saves the day, prevents Jenna's sacrificial murder, conveniently slays the rampaging horned god, and even politely declines an offer to become Jenna's king consort. Our barbarian has his pride. Then he wanders off. Cue the end title card hinting at more adventures that Spoiler alert, we never got. If that sounds like the movie version of a child's paint by numbers, that's because it is. The film's basic storyline could be lifted from just about any D&D module or a cheap 80s fantasy knockoff, which is strange because the first Conan was the kind of movie that produced knockoffs in a new genre altogether, one with muscular barbarians. Destroyer used the oldest plot the genre has to offer, one where the hero sets off on a mission for a princess, picks up allies along the way, gets into a lot of fights, and lives to save the day. It's a far cry from the personal, quasi-philosophical revenge arc that drove the first Conan film. Here, Conan is essentially a sword for hire on a fetch quest. The characters he teams up with are also stock archetypes. For example, the sheltered princess destined to be a sacrifice, the cowardly comic relief thief, the trusty old wizard, the feral warrior woman, and the obvious turncoat guard. The adventure itself is episodic and follows the formula of finding a MacGuffin so that they can find another MacGuffin so someone can do a grand something. Even the magical elements, which the first film used sparingly, are thrown around liberally here without much awe or wonder, creating a problem of plenty. By the time Conan is getting his hands on a horn out of a rubber monster's skull in the finale, it's clear we're a long way from the grim grandeur of Conan the Barbarian. And all these issues simply happened because the studio didn't know who the right audience was and what made the first film work. So the second and more obvious problem here was corporate greed, the greed of the executives to milk Conan as much as possible. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, who the hell was the movie made for? And this tonal whiplash of Conan the Destroyer can be traced directly to a disastrous studio miscalculation. After the first film's success, producer Dino De Laurentiis and Universal Pictures convinced themselves that Conan could make even more money if only it weren't so violent and adults only. Their logic was that Conan the Barbarian made about $40 million in the US with an R rating. Imagine how much a toned-down Conan, accessible to kids, could gross. Thus, they decreed the sequel would drop from an R to a PG. And we must remember here that the PG-13 rating didn't exist yet, and it was introduced in mid-1984, just weeks after Destroyer's June release. Anyway, this decision proved to be an epic misjudgment. In chasing a broader audience, the filmmakers ended up in a no-man's land of tone. Naturally, Conan the Destroyer feels caught between two narrative masters. On the one hand, it's sillier and softer than the first film, clearly angling for that family-friendly vibe, and on the other hand, it still has enough stabbings, impalings, and hints of the horny and scanty clothing to push the limits of PG. I mean, Zula's behind was covered only with a tail. That's all. In a clear case of betwixt and between, the movie satisfied no one. So to answer the question I posed earlier, Destroyer was a movie with too much violence and skin, but too soft and silly for adults, and it was probably made for 10 and 12-year-olds who loved decapitations. Furthermore, to ensure a PG rating, extensive cuts and edits were made to the final version of the film, and actress Sarah Douglas, who played Queen Taramis, later revealed that several of her scenes landed on the cutting room floor due to content. Among these was a sequence where Taramis attempts to seduce Conan. Yes, there was almost a Conan Queen sex scene, and then there was a virgin sacrifice sequence as well, both removed. In fact, the finale originally had Taramis seducing a statue of Dagoth to magically awaken the god, but it was deemed too suggestive and definitely too bizarre for PG. Even some violent bits were trimmed or toned down, and that's why Conan was no longer biting on vulture necks or being chased by bloodthirsty dogs, and not even nude orgies or implied bestiality. In the aftermath, Dino De Laurentiis' gamble of less violence equals more money backfired. Conan the Destroyer grossed only about $31 million in the US, and roughly $30 million more in limited overseas rentals. That's less than half of the original's worldwide take, even accounting for its slightly reduced budget, around $18 million, actually lower than the first film's $20 million. Destroyer was a box office disappointment by studio expectations. One might say it made a Conan-sized profit and a Thulsa Doom-sized dent in the franchise's momentum. The film wasn't an outright flop. It did earn back its budget, but it was a letdown, and nowhere near the crossover hit the studio imagined a PG Conan could be. Sometimes chasing a broader rating and audience just leaves you with a broad mess. Another big change from the original was the person who was behind the camera. John Milius, the passionate auteur of Conan the Barbarian, was unavailable for the sequel since he was off making Red Dawn. Rather than wait for Milius, Dino De Laurentiis went in a completely different direction. Milius had drawn inspiration for Barbarian's tone and visuals from the classic 1958 film The Vikings. So Dino figured, why not hire the guy who directed The Vikings? This is when filmmaker Richard Fleischer came into the picture. Now, the thing is, he was pretty old by now and was just happy to be given something to work on, which meant that the creative control lay with Dino De Laurentiis. Having said that, Fleischer had solid action chops from his movies like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, The Vikings, and Soylent Green. In practice, however, Fleischer lacked the fiery spark that Milius brought to Conan's world. Milius approached Barbarian with the fervor of a true believer and injected philosophical musings, operatic imagery, and a distinctly Howardian grimness. Fleischer, in contrast, was a bit perfunctory yet professional. What I mean is, Destroyer was not sloppily made, at least on a technical level, but it also isn't inspired. Action scenes that could be thrilling, like Conan's duel with the mirror monster, felt flat. The magic and supernatural elements, which Milius kept mysterious and eerie, are staged here with a pedestrian touch, more Harryhausen-light than awe-inspiring. It didn't help that the studio was micromanaging the tone toward PG silliness, and Fleischer later delivered another cheesy De Laurentiis sword-and-sorcery flick in 1985 called Red Sonja. Oh, and a new Red Sonja movie is around the corner. Let me know if you're looking forward to it. In Destroyer, he amped up bits of slapstick and humor that feels at odds with the previous film. Conan now has wisecracks and one-liners, but back in the day, Arnold had extremely limited acting range, so those punchlines felt like flat lines. There's even an absolutely unnecessary running gag of Malik the Thief being cowardly and getting smacked around. Even violent moments are sometimes played for laughs. For example, Conan punching a camel, again, after the camel spits on him, or Malik accidentally shooting Conan with a crossbow by mistake. So the tone basically oscillates between attempted comedy and heroic fantasy, and much like a pendulum, it never remains at one place or commits to one thing. Now, you can't talk about Conan the Destroyer's problems without talking about the script, which went through its own saga. Initially, the sequel's story was conceived by two people who know Conan very well: Roy Thomas and Jerry Conway, both veteran writers of the Conan Marvel comics. Thomas and Conway penned a screenplay titled Conan, King of Thieves, which was a follow-up that stayed true to the character and world they'd written in comics. However, their draft was ultimately heavily rewritten by screenwriter Stanley Mann, and the film was retitled Conan the Destroyer. Thomas and Conway ended up with only a story by credit, as much of their original plot was altered or discarded. In fact, Dino De Laurentiis also gave the two writers an infinite number of notes to ensure that the movie was less and less expensive. Now, he was not equipped with the prerequisite creative skills, but I guess no one told him that. So how different were Thomas and Conway's visions from what we got to see? Apparently, quite a bit. The changes were so extensive, and in their view detrimental, that Thomas and Conway basically disowned the movie. They later took their original Conan idea and turned it into a graphic novel of their own called Conan, the Horn of Azoth. To distance this graphic novel from the film, they changed all the names, and the Princess Jenna became Natari, Dagoth became Azoth, Zula became Shumbala, etc. It was essentially the "see, this is how our Conan story was supposed to go" version of events. The dialogue is another sore point. In the original, Conan was a man of few words, which played to Arnold's strengths and kept Conan mysterious. Here, Conan is positively chatty. The script gives him more lines and even comedy quips, an ill-advised attempt to humanize or lighten him up. Arnold does his best, but many of the one-liners land with a thud. or feel out of character. At one point, Conan awkwardly tries to console the princess, even waxing sentimental about Valeria, a scene that comes off as unintentionally funny because Schwarzenegger simply isn't convincing, delivering heartfelt dialogue. Seeing Conan try to emote and crack jokes was just so embarrassing to watch, I almost felt sorry for poor Arnold. It certainly didn't play to his stoic strengths. Beyond Conan himself, the script saddles the supporting cast with paper-thin characterizations and cheesy banter. There's a lot of exposition spoken out loud, and characters tell us obvious things. For example, we must get the horn. Yes, we gathered that. Much of the acting devolves into grunting and flamboyant arm-waving because the script gives the actors so little of substance to work with. The humor often falls flat. For instance, Malick's cowardly antics get repetitive, and the film's idea of a running joke is him attempting to drink a potion only to spit it out in disgust. It's almost as if the writers, or the studio execs directing them, looked at the success of family fantasy films like Clash of the Titans, or the lighter moments of Raiders of the Lost Ark, and said, do that with Conan. Needless to say, the alchemy didn't work. As if script and tone issues weren't enough, Conan the Destroyer also made some questionable casting choices. And non-choices. Schwarzenegger himself, of course, returned as Conan. So did the inimitable Mako as the Wizard, though his character is oddly renamed Akira this time. But Sandahl Bergman, who is so memorable as Valeria in the first film, did not return, her character being dead and all, aside from a brief dream cameo. Instead, the sequel loaded up on a new ensemble that can only be described as eclectic. First up, we have Wilt Chamberlain. Yes, the NBA legend, as Bambata, the princess's eunuch bodyguard. This was Wilt's first and only real film role. At 7 foot 1 inch tall, he certainly looks imposing next to Arnold, and physically he fits the bill of a mighty warrior. But Wilt was not an actor by trade, and it shows. His performance is, shall we say, straightforwardly stiff. The film wisely doesn't give Bambata many lines beyond grunting and pledging loyalty to the queen. Chamberlain's casting was clearly a bit of stunt casting. The producers likely thought having two giants, Wilt and 7 foot 4 inch Andre the Giant, who cameos in the monster suit, in the movie would be a cool hook. And admittedly, seeing Arnold, who was no small man at 6'2", dwarfed by Wilt in some shots, is a fun visual. But Chamberlain brings physical presence and little else. He's a fur-covered brutality, without a shred of compelling motivation. Then there's Grace Jones as Zula. Jones was a model and singer, a bona fide pop culture icon known for her androgynous, fierce persona, but she was not known as an actress prior to this. To her credit, Grace Jones commits to the role of the feral bandit woman. Clad in leather straps, wielding a spear, she prowls and snarls convincingly. Her intense physicality gives Zula a certain wild charm. Some critics actually found her the most engaging part of the crew. Still, Jones was another case of casting for aura over acting chops. The filmmakers clearly wanted her unique charisma in the movie, and they got it, though they limited her dialogue as well. So it was all about her Grace Jonesness more than anything else. For Princess Jenna, the filmmakers went with a complete newcomer, Olivia Dabo, a 15-year-old actress making her film debut. She turned 16 during filming. Dabo's youth and inexperience are pretty evident as Jenna comes off as a wide-eyed, sometimes whiny teenager. The script tasks her with being naive and innocent, and occasionally the butt of a joke, as when she asks Malick to explain what's kissing. Dabo does project the requisite innocence, but whenever she has to deliver more weighty lines or show fear or despair, her inexperience peeks through. It didn't help that the film somewhat creepily frames Jenna as a budding love interest for Conan. There's an icky undertone in scenes where Jenna flirts with Conan, given the actress's age, though Arnold's Conan remains honorably oblivious, still pining for Valeria. Dabo later got a Golden Raspberry Award for Worst New Star for this role, which was a bit harsh perhaps. In fairness, expecting a young first-timer to shine in a role that vacillates between damsel and pseudo-love interest was asking a lot. Dabo did what she could, but Jenna is mostly a one-note character in her own right. And then we have Tracy Walter as Malick, the comic relief thief. This character divides opinion, to put it mildly. Malik is clearly meant to be Destroyer's answer to Subutai from the first film, a smaller sidekick to bounce off Conan, albeit with a heavy dose of goofy humor. Tracy Walter is a character actor who can be great in sleazy or quirky roles, and he later played Bob the Goon in Batman '89. As Malik, he goes all in on clumsy, chattering slapstick. Whether he's failing at lockpicking, nervously laughing, or whining about injuries, Malik is supposed to make us chuckle. Unfortunately, many like me found him intensely annoying. His high-pitched giggles and cowardly antics wear thin fast. Tracy Walter was so bad, I spent the entire film wishing something nasty would put him out of my misery. No such luck, I'm afraid. It doesn't help that the ensemble as a whole doesn't gel particularly well. There's not much chemistry or camaraderie. They feel like random characters thrown together. Compare this to the original, where the trio of Conan, Valeria, and Subotai had a bond forged in blood and treasure, and we cared about them. Like we genuinely cared. In Destroyer, you get the sense the actors themselves were unsure what tone to strike, given the uneven script. Still, credit where it's due, Arnold does his level best to hold the center. By now, he had grown more confident as a screen presence, and he carries Conan with that innate charisma and physicality that made him a star. It's just that the movie around him isn't rising to the occasion. The troubles for Conan the Destroyer didn't end in pre-production. When it came time to actually film Conan the Destroyer, the project was operating under some tighter purse strings and odd circumstances. Despite the success of the first film, the sequel's budget was trimmed to around $18 million, a bit less than Barbarian's. Dino De Laurentiis, ever the frugal showman, decided to cut costs by filming in Mexico. In fact, Destroyer was shot in Mexico City and various locations in Mexico from late 1983 through early 1984. Even more interesting is that it used many of the same crew and locations as David Lynch's Dune, which Dino was producing at the same time in Mexico. So while Lynch was shooting giant sandworms for Dune on one set, Richard Fleischer was a stone's throw away shooting Conan battling camel-riding bandits. This back-to-back production arrangement might have saved money on sets and crew, but it also gives Destroyer a bit of a rushed feel. There's a sense that it was a shoot-it-quick and cheap operation versus the more lavish approach of the first film, which had been shot in Spain with painstaking attention to detail. The lower budget shows up most glaringly in the special effects and creature design. For a fantasy adventure, Destroyer sports some decidedly subpar effects work, especially by modern standards. And even by 1984 standards, it was mixed. The Sorcerer's Castle sequence features some rough optical effects. The wizard transforms into a giant bird via some cheesy animation, and later the magical collapsing castle is realized with unconvincing matte paintings and miniatures. There's extensive use of rear projection for backgrounds where the actors ride horseback or confront creatures that looks painfully obvious on screen. Conan's battle with the man-ape mirror creature, for example, has a stuntman in a creature suit and some imaginative mirror shattering, but the choreography is slow and the creature design a bit meh. And then there's Dagoth, the evil god beast awakened in the finale. In concept, Dagoth is a Lovecraftian elder god of nightmares. In execution, Dagoth is literally Andre the Giant in a rubber suit and latex prosthetic mask. Carlo Rambaldi, the renowned effects artist who created E.T. and worked on Alien, designed the Dagoth creature, which is mind-blowing because you'd never guess the same genius was involved. To be fair, the suit might have been serviceable if shot carefully in darkness and shadow, but Fleischer shows it in bright light, full frame, and it looks, well, like a bulky rubber monster suit. Dagoth has a goofy, grotesque face, kind of a cross between a xenomorph and a deep-sea fish, and stiff movements. The creature's big rampage consists of lurching around the throne room, swiping at heroes in what amounts to slow-motion pro wrestling moves. No surprise, since Andre the Giant was indeed a pro wrestler. At one point, he literally picks up Conan and spins him around overhead, which is simultaneously hilarious and meant to be scary. The monster effects were so underwhelming that even critics who normally didn't nitpick such things made note. The Dagoth suit has been called a travesty, a subpar rubber suit that the film was wise to show only briefly. One might say Dagoth was more dumb than demonic. Other production values were a mixed bag. The set designs by Peter Luigi Basile are actually decent. The crypts, temples, and throne rooms have a classic swords and sorcery flair. Lots of skull motifs, torches, and stonework. There's an impressive ancient temple set for the horn retrieval, and the Hall of Mirrors set is neat in concept. But due to the lighter tone and flat direction, these settings don't evoke much atmosphere. They often come across as obvious soundstage sets. The costumes vary from cool stuff like Conan's fur loincloth and headband to unintentionally funny ones like some of Queen Taramis's palace guards having helmets that resemble sparkly cone heads. Grace Jones's barely there leather outfit certainly makes an impression. The musical score, composed again by the great Basil Poledouris, reuses some themes from the first movie, such as the magnificent Anvil of Crom and the Orgy, but over a more lighthearted canvas. Poledouris did what he could, but even he seemed uninspired. On the whole, the reduced budget also led to less time for things like choreography and stunt refinement, perhaps. For instance, the big skirmish where Conan's party fights Taramis's guards is serviceable but hardly breathtaking, and you can occasionally see an extra waiting for their cue to fall down. Small stuff, but it adds up. The fact that Destroyer was released in summer 1984, just weeks after Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and around the same time as Ghostbusters and Gremlins, meant it was up against films that balanced effects, scares, and humor far more deftly. Perhaps no one was more let down by Conan the Destroyer than Conan himself, Arnold Schwarzenegger. This sequel marked Arnold's second outing in the role that had made him a star, and it was supposed to propel him further. Instead, it nearly made him hang up his sword for good. Behind the scenes, Schwarzenegger reportedly knew the film wasn't shaping up well. He found the script too childish and fought to inject more seriousness, but his objections were overruled by the producers, intent on a kid-friendly Conan. Arnold had good instincts. He understood what Conan should be, but at this point in his career, he didn't have the clout to dictate changes. Universal was fresh off the massive success of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which had convinced Hollywood that family-oriented PG entertainment was the true path to riches. Schwarzenegger lobbying for a bloodier, gutsier Conan fell on deaf ears amid studio execs dreaming of a new line of Conan toys and lunchboxes. In later reflections, Arnold noted that Destroyer missed the boat by going PG, implying he would have preferred sticking to the harder tone. When Conan the Destroyer underperformed and was met with critical meh, Schwarzenegger's reaction was essentially, never again. At least for a long while. He was under contract for one more Conan-related film, but he became disillusioned with the franchise after the experience of Destroyer. In fact, the only reason Arnold played a Conan-esque character again was due to a contractual trick. Dino De Laurentiis still owed Universal one more Conan appearance from Arnold, so he roped him into a 1985 spin-off, Red Sonja, but billed Schwarzenegger as Lord Calidor instead of Conan, since the movie wasn't officially a Conan sequel. Red Sonja turned out even worse. More on that soon. And Arnold was very done with sword-swinging barbarians after that. By pivoting away from Conan, Arnold saved his rising career. Post-Destroyer, he moved into more modern action roles like The Terminator, which came out later in 1984 and rocketed him to a whole new level of fame. The immediate aftermath of Conan the Destroyer was brutal, at least for Conan's cinematic future. Remember that at the end of the first film, and again at the end of Destroyer, a title card promised that Conan would become king and have further adventures. The plan was indeed to make a third film, often referred to as Conan the Conqueror, which would presumably feature King Conan's later life. Well, Destroyer's lackluster reception put those plans on ice. The third Conan film was indefinitely postponed. De Laurentiis, however, wasn't quite done with the sword and sorcery genre. He tried a quasi-Conan film without Conan. Yeah, as I mentioned, he did Red Sonja in 1985, directed by Richard Fleischer again, and starring Brigitte Nielsen as the titular she warrior. Arnold was roped in for a supporting hero role, as mentioned, named Calidor due to rights issues. Effectively, Conan in everything but name and hair color. If Destroyer wounded the genre, Red Sonja delivered the death blow. It was a critical and commercial bomb, earning a measly $6.9 million against a $17.9 million budget. Audiences had little interest, and the film is often ridiculed. Arnold himself had joked that Red Sonja is the worst film he's been in. Its failure, coming so soon after Destroyer, signaled that the public's appetite for loincloth-clad heroes had dried up fast. But what about that third Conan film? Well, it languished in development hell for years. At one point in the late 80s, the intended Conan the Destroyer script was repurposed into a different Howard property in 1997 called Kull the Conqueror. Kevin Sorbo, famous from TV's Hercules, was cast as Kull. Notably, Sorbo reportedly didn't want to play Conan as he felt stepping directly into Arnold's shoes was unwise. Hence, the Howard character was switched to Kull. The resulting film used pieces of what might have been the Conan story. In fact, early drafts of Kull were basically Conan 3, with names changed. Unfortunately, Kull the Conqueror flopped too, and is largely forgotten, effectively closing the book on the De Laurentiis era of Howard adaptations. Thankfully, decades passed. The sword and sorcery genre were dormant in Hollywood features. It wasn't until the 2000s, with The Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, that fantasy made a huge comeback. But those were a different flavor of fantasy, more high fantasy and sophisticated than the pulpy barbarian tales of old. Conan did see a brief revival attempt in the form of a 2011 reboot, Conan the Barbarian starring Jason Momoa. However, that film failed to capture any Conan magic and bombed financially. Fans and critics felt it repeated many of Destroyer's mistakes of a weak script, an over-reliance on CGI spectacle, and a misunderstanding of what made Howard's Conan unique. Even Momoa himself later called the 2011 film a big pile of shit, crying about the fact that it was taken over by studio meddling and lost what could have made it good. But hey, his Apple TV show Chief of War looks good, right? Even so, Arnold has never quite given up on Conan. As recently as 2025, he said he's still hoping to do a proper sequel to his 1982 Conan. If you have the right director and the right writing, there could be a really good franchise to continue King Conan, Schwarzenegger mused, expressing his wish to give Conan the finale fans crave. It remains uncertain if that will ever happen. Hollywood rights issues and the star's age, Arnold's in his late 70s, are significant factors. But the very fact that, 41 years after Destroyer, people, including Arnold, are still talking about a Conan sequel tells you about the character's immortal appeal. Marvelous verdict. In the end, Conan the Destroyer turned out to be aptly named. It destroyed Conan's live-action momentum for decades. What was meant to be a franchise-launching sequel instead became a textbook case on how a film can go wrong when it loses sight of its soul. The film isn't entirely without entertainment value. There is a goofy charm to parts of it, and some fans enjoy it as a guilty pleasure, but it's largely viewed as a disappointment relative to its mighty predecessor. It stands as a cautionary tale against watering down source material, against making creative decisions purely by commercial calculus, and against rushing a sequel without a solid plan. The lamentations of the fans have been heard since 1984. They wanted a Conan saga of high adventure and blood and thunder, and instead, they got something that felt like it was a Saturday morning cartoon with occasional stabbings. Well, that was all in this one, folks. See you around.